Konnichiwa. Today, we're going to talk about how to use correct, natural Japanese, even if your experience of Japanese isn't that huge. Is this possible? It is possible if we use the techniques I'm about to teach you. Now, these are related primarily to writing, but they're going to have an effect on your Japanese as a whole. So, first of all, let's talk about writing. As you know, languages can be divided into 4 skills: reading and writing, speaking and listening. And usually they're divided in that way, the reading skills and the speaking skills. But there's another very important way of dividing them, and that is reading and listening, speaking and writing. That is to say, the input skills and the output skills. Now, there are people who say that you shouldn't output, as they put it, for rather a long time. And I've made a video explaining why that is a very mistaken idea, and even the scientific basis on which it claims to be founded is misunderstood and misquoted. We actually need to output in order to learn language. And that's because the human mind is made for language. And it's not just made for language, it's also largely made by language. That's to say, we couldn't think half the abstract and complex things we do think if we didn't have the tool of language to help us to think them. Now, because of this, the human mind privileges language above just about everything else other than physical survival. It has an inbuilt capacity for grasping and absorbing language, and all humans have this facility built in, but it only becomes activated with what the brain regards as language, and that means the means of communication. It doesn't give this privilege to games or academic subjects or anything else. So long as your Japanese remains in the realm of an academic subject or a game, it's not getting the privileges that language gets. It's only when we start, at least in some circumstances, using it as the means of communication, that it is regarded by the mind as language, treated by the mind as language, and absorbed in the way that language is absorbed. So clearly this means that if we possibly can, we need to start speaking. Massive input is important. We get most of what we know about language from massive amounts of language input. That's how children learn, isn't it? Well, it's half of how children learn, and the other half is by attempting to output what they've had put in. And this helps in a great variety of ways. In speaking, some people mistakenly say that you don't learn anything from speaking unless somebody is correcting you. That's not in fact true. And too much correction is a bad thing. It breaks the flow of communication. It stops the mind regarding it as language. If you're unlucky, it pushes the mind into regarding it as an academic subject, which gets it demoted right down the scale of your brain's priorities, from language to something relatively unimportant. You're in fact learning even if nobody's correcting you, because human communication is a dynamic thing. If you're really communicating with someone and not just practicing Japanese, you will have a sense of when your communication is landing and when it's missing. You'll know it from the way the person responds, even in non-verbal ways. You'll certainly know it from how they reply to you. Have they understood what you're saying? Have they felt what you're saying? Or has it gone astray? Or have they mistaken it for something else? This is the sort of thing that, far more than abstract correction, helps us to get the feel for communication. So, that's speech. Why is writing important? Well, writing is very interesting because it's a whole different area of language. It's probably the least highly regarded of the 4 skills, but it has its own characteristics that make it just as important as the others. In speaking, we are communicating on the fly. while we learn what lands and what doesn't, what communicates with the other person and what doesn't, we're not refining our skills very much. We're not learning to say more abstract things than we were able to say before. Can writing teach us that? Absolutely it can, if we use the right techniques. So when do we write? Well, we might open a Twitter account. We might take part in Japanese forums. We might write stories. That doesn't matter too much. The important thing is that in writing, unlike in speaking, we have time to really find out how to say what we want to say. And when we confront a problem in expressing Japanese and solve it, that encounter with the correct way to say something is going to enter our consciousness and our memory much more strongly than simply passively hearing it. Passive hearing and passive reading is important, but the power of actually solving problems for ourselves and communicating something in a correct way is far more potent. I'm not saying that we should be doing this instead of reading and listening. We need a lot of reading and listening, but this is a very important supplement. So now the key point is, how do we find out what's the right way to communicate something? Across different languages, especially across very different languages like English or any other European language and Japanese, it's not just a question of knowing the right words, it's a question of knowing the right communication strategies. Japanese often has communication strategies that are very different from English communication strategies. For example, we might say, some people are like that. And if we wanted to write that in Japanese, and we didn't know how it's normally said in Japanese, we might try to plug Japanese words into the English formula. But actually, Japanese people don't use the English formula, the English structure at all. They are more likely to say, "Soyu hito mo iru," which is saying, in fact, thus described people also exist. That is how in Japanese you say, some people are like that. Now you can see that if a Japanese person said to you, thus described people also exist, you wouldn't know what they meant. And it's the same the other way around. You've got to use not only the right words, not only correct grammar, but the communication strategies that actually are used by Japanese people. Otherwise, you end up with Hongo, which is the other side of Japlish. You all know what Japlish is when you hear English spoken in a very Japanese way and you can hardly make out what it really means. Well, it's just the same the other way around. English-speaking people can end up speaking Hongo. So how do we find our way around that? Well, the thing is that when we are communicating in writing, we can research it, and there are some very simple ways to do so. Our main tool here is going to be sentence databases. Now, there are several of these online. There's one built into Jisho, and it's a reasonably good one. There's another one called Alc, and there's another one called Weblio, which is my favorite. Let's assume we're using Weblio. So what we do when we want to say something, the first thing we can do is check whether what we're saying is actually said in Japanese. So what we do is we take the expression we're using, we cut it down to the basics of that expression, because these are not like Google Translate. They're not generating sentences. They're databases of a very large number of already existing sentences made by humans, which is much more important. Weblio, for example, is made by Japanese people and for Japanese people, so occasionally the English is going to be a bit weird, but the Japanese isn't, and that's the important thing. So what you do is, if you have an idea of how you want to express yourself, try searching that in its most basic form, cutting out any specific details and just getting down to the core expression. Search that on Weblio and see if you find other examples of that collocation. And if you do, whether the English translations mean what it was that you were trying to express. Now, collocations are very important. A lot of Western people like to think that they speak in unique combinations of words, but most of the time they're using words in groups and combinations that are commonly used and frequent. And in fact, if they weren't doing that, we'd have a lot more difficulty in hearing and understanding what they were saying. So we see if that collocation exists and if it means what we thought it meant. If it does, that's fine, we can use that. If it exists and doesn't mean exactly what we thought it meant, or if it doesn't exist at all, if it doesn't exist in the database, it doesn't mean it's impossible. What you can do then is try searching it on Google in Japanese, in quotation marks. But to do this, you need a little bit of knowledge of Japanese because you need to be able to read the results and see if they seem to mean what it was that you were trying to convey. The advantage of something like Weblio is that you do have English translations to help you out. Now, if what you were trying to say doesn't seem to exist or doesn't seem to mean what you thought it meant, what can you do? Well, you can search the other way around. You can put in what it was you were trying to say in English into Weblio and see what sentences come out. By this method, you can work out how to actually say in natural Japanese what it was you were trying to say. And as I say, doing this is going to lodge in your mind the way of expressing this particular concept, this particular turn of phrase, much more deeply than just hearing it. You can hear it a dozen times, but once you've actually gone through it yourself, worked out what it is you had to say, and then incorporated it in your tweet or your story or whatever, this is going to get much more deeply lodged in your mind, and this is one of the reasons why it's very important. And it's also very important never to just do this search and then plug in what you find without understanding it. You've got to make sure that you really understand what is being said and how it's being said and what strategy is being used. But with the techniques I've taught you, you ought to be able to do that. And if you're really stuck, you could always ask me in the comment section. Sometimes you'll find pretty much exactly what you want to say if it's a common kind of expression, but you can also use it for much more granular things, like, for example, if you want to know how bakari is used with the te form, you can just put in quotes te bakari and see what comes up. And you can see what kinds of things are being expressed with bakari following the te form. And just about any piece of Japanese structure you can plug in, see if that's being used the way you think it's being used, and if it is, then you have a very good chance of using it correctly yourself, in your tweet, in your story, in your post, whatever. Also, if you want to know if something seems idiomatic, you can put it in quotes and run it through Google, and Google's going to come back telling you how many times this particular combination has been found. For using Google, you need to be a little bit more advanced because you need to go through at least some of those results and make sure they're being used in the way you thought they were being used. And that's less easy to do without an English translation. But if you can do that, obviously you've got a much wider field to work with. However, the databases with English translations are very big, and there are at least 3 major ones that you can choose from. I would go to Weblio first, and if you don't find what you want there, try one of the others. If you don't find it anywhere, probably it's a good idea not to use it. When people speak in their native language, a very important part of the apparatus they have is a database in their head of which words belong together, what strategies are used for expressing different things. When you're speaking in Japanese, you don't have that database, but very luckily online you have something pretty close to that database which you can use artificially to make your Japanese correct and natural, and which, over time, you're transferring into your own head. Your own database is built up by using online databases. And because all 4 skills of Japanese work together, this is going to integrate with the rest of your Japanese. You're going to be able to use these more sophisticated forms of expression when you speak. Once you get used to them for writing, you're going to hear them. You're going to recognize them more easily when you hear them because you've used them. And often when you look something up in a database, you're going to say, yes, that's right. I've heard that before. So each of the 4 skills feeds into the other 3 and feeds off the other 3. And this is really the way a child actually learns, by piecing together the whole experience of living a language. If you have any questions or comments, please put them in the comments below and I will answer as usual. I'd like to thank my Gold Kokeshi patrons, my producer angels who make these videos possible, and all my angel patrons and my supporters on Patreon and everywhere. Without them, none of this could exist. And I'd like to thank you for attending this lesson. これからもよろしくお願いします。Class dismissed.